Welcome to Shop Talk Live episode number 244. Today, we've got a different episode for you. And by we, I mean Jon Binzen interviews Laura Meigs, who is a woodworker, a designer, and the director of the Krenov School of Fine Woodworking. We really thought that it was going to be a normal Shop Talk Live episode. Jon was going to interview Laura a little bit and then ask her listener questions. But Laura's story and views are so engaging that the interview just went on for the entire episode, and I felt like a better person for it. I think you will too. For those of you watching the video, it might look a little deceiving. Jon is actually sitting in my chair in my shop, which is now, I guess, our default podcast studio. Before I hand it over to Jon and Laura, I want to let everyone know that if you've been on the fence about starting a 2-week trial of a Fine Woodworking Unlimited membership, now is the time. I just got word that anyone signing up for their 2-week trial right now will get a free download of Lon Schleining's legendary book, The Workbench. It is one of those old school, beautifully photographed look at all sorts of various workbenches and how people use them, and it's pretty mesmerizing. You're going to love it. If you want to get in on that deal, the URL is just way too long. I can't give it to you. Head on over to the show notes page at Shop Talk Live and click on the show notes for this episode 244, and I will have a link for you there. All right, on with the episode after a brief word from one of our sponsors. This episode is sponsored by Maverick Abrasives. Maverick is a family-run company that's been making sanding belts and discs for woodworkers in the USA for 30 years. With Maverick, you're buying factory direct, so you're likely to save a lot of money. I just looked around my shop at the various abrasives that I use, and I did the math. If I bought everything directly from Maverick, I would save around 40% on my sanding discs and belts. Maverick has all of the popular size belts and discs in stock on their website, but they can also make any custom sizes that you might need. Check out their website at maverickabrasives.com or give one of their owners, Garrett, a call at 714-646-3299 and use the code FINEWOODWORKING. That's one word, FINEWOODWORKING, for 10% off your order. Again, that's maverickabrasives.com and the code is FINEWOODWORKING.
So we have not met before. So hi.
No.
And I just wanted to say a word about you. That for the last 10 years, is that right? You've been director of the Krenov School, formerly College of the Redwoods.
That's right. Almost to the day. I came over August 2011. I was delayed by a month because of my visa. So So exactly a year.
And also just wanted to mention, as will become clear as we go along, that in addition to teaching and directing the school, you're very active as a maker. And I was looking at a lot of your work over the last few days, and just wanted to remark on how subtle and playful and inquisitive and beautiful it is, in a combination that I think is really rare and really wonderful. And it blends woodworking mastery with intellectual curiosity, and I think it's really great. You also, it's clear that you rely on traditional craft and traditional technique, and you've obviously are plugged into traditional form as well, and kind of history of furniture. But then there's also so much else that's flowing into it from contemporary furniture and abstract art and all sorts of different places. And I think a lot of that will come out as we talk, but I just wanted to say how impressive I found that.
Well, thank you.
And I was wondering if maybe we could start by talking about your background, where you grew up, and how that went, where you were and what happened.
How that went. I was born and brought up in Dublin, Ireland. My parents moved there just months before I was born. They'd actually lived in Canada prior to that, although they're of German and English extraction. So I grew up in Ireland kind of like anomalously, because most people in Ireland at the time were very Irish and very Catholic, and, could trace their roots back, about 1,000 years probably, if they tried hard enough. So somewhat of a kind of an outsider feel to my upbringing there. But it was incredibly happy in a really beautiful suburb of South County Dublin. Both my parents are professors of English.
Oh, really? Because that was another thing that I was feeling in reading what you wrote about your work, is how infused it is with language, and how language seems very important in the work as well. And so, yeah, not surprised to hear
I
that
often think that I ended up at the Krenov School because of Krenov's writing style. I feel like it was his writing style that actually drew me in, and and then look what happened. Because I love his style. I think it's really kind of like it's got this kind of rhythm. It's like it just kind of rolls along. And I genuinely, I would open one of his books at kind of almost at random and just start reading and find myself 15, 20 minutes later, elsewhere in the book. And so I sometimes blame his literary style, not blame, attribute his literary style to the course of my life.
Well, I'd like to talk about that in a little more depth, but that move to California from Ireland, but maybe you could say a bit more about what your young life was like, what kind of school you went to, and what kind of things you were interested in, attracted to.
Well, I am a definite introvert, and it showed from an early age. I remember my friends would say, well, what do you do all the time? And I'd be like, well, I read and I draw. And that's basically what I did. I read and I drew a lot. And I had lots of time, that kind of like, at the age of 10 or 12 or whatever, I thought I was going to be an illustrator. I thought that's what I wanted to do with my life. And I guess maybe that, just from what you're saying right now, like words and images are pretty important to me. And also I liked the technical sort of side of illustration. I used to, there's a British illustrator called Edward Ardizzoni, and I used to just love his work, and I used to just copy it like relentlessly. I would just copy drawings by him. Lots and lots of cross-hatching. So yeah, I thought I wanted to be an illustrator, but I was kind of one of those kids who was very good at school, if you know what I mean. I understood what they wanted of me. So I was good at giving it back. I went to a Catholic school, a convent for 4 years, and then I moved to what's called a comprehensive school. But anyway, in all of them, I kind of did everything. I did art and drama, and I was good at maths and English, and just kind of like had this kind of like slightly all over the place interests. And I think that's probably why I went to do architecture, is because it seemed like a fairly big bag, as it were, like a big topic where you could pull the various kind of things together. And it has a lot of drawing, which I really like. So I went off and studied architecture at the age of 18 in Dublin, in the university there.
Had you gotten into craft at all by that point, making stuff physically, or was it on paper mostly?
It was mostly paper. I made collages a lot. I did a lot of collaging. But that was probably mostly I just did pen and ink drawings. And I think it's partly the times, and, there was no such thing as a wood shop at the convent. And then when I went to shockingly enough, and then when I went to the other school, it was kind of streamed, and gendered.
The architecture.
This is at the second school I went to. High school I went to. So if you were non-academic, you were streamed into the metal shop and the wood shop. And if you were female also, you were far less likely to end up there. So, they were streaming the more academic people to go to college. And so they weren't,
Yeah.
we did more conventional subjects.
And did the practical aspect of architecture figure into the attraction of it for you also?
Absolutely. But, I got there and found that really the main thing we made was drawings. We didn't really make anything else. We made models, I guess, scale models of buildings, but we didn't. I find that by far the most frustrating part of architecture was that we didn't, in fact, make anything. I think it's changed a lot now. I mean, I went back as a teacher, as a guest lecturer a couple of times, and they were doing so much more kind of hands-on stuff. But the whole idea of what's his name? The guy in the southern states, Mockbee, is that his name? Yeah, and kind of design and build and everything was just not on the radar. It was we made drawings. That's what we made, and it was almost to the point where you forgot that the drawings were to serve a purpose, which is to build a building.
And how
the drawings
long was
started
that?
becoming. That was a 5-year program.
Wow.
Yeah, it was big.
Wow. Sheesh. And so then where you've completed it? And
well, actually, I took a year out, and most people took a year out and they went and worked in architects' offices, but I went to art school for a year because I thought I might drop out of architecture. And I went to the School of Art in Glasgow for a year.
Oh.
And somehow,
that poor old School of Art. It's had its woes.
I know.
God.
It's like tragic twice. Yeah.
2 fires. Ay.
Beautiful, amazing. I was actually, it was weird because you just are in that building. You just go up those steps every day like it's your normal thing. It was really great. And I actually was going to study photography if I had stayed on in that college, but I decided to return and finish off my architecture degree. So I when I look back on that, I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of like technical. It has that, it's that kind of mix of technical and kind of image making that makes sense.
Wait, which photography or architecture?
Photography, yeah.
And so then when you finished at the architecture program, where did you head from there?
I was pretty much not wanting to work in an architect's office. I'd worked in architects' offices a lot every summer. And I got to the point where I couldn't even stand the smell of the carpets or the sound of the photocopier.
That's not good.
No, not good.
You've reached a point.
Yeah, and I hate talking on the phone. And that's pretty much what architects do, is they tell other people what to do over the phone and in drawings.
No, it should look like this. This is what we want.
Yeah, and I felt so bad because you tell people what to do and you don't actually know how to do it yourself. And they have this weird mix of respect and disrespect for you. Because, they're just like, oh God, it's the architect coming again to, come and mess up our lives. And yet as an architect, you actually don't know how to do what you're telling them to do. Find it very, very frustrating as the best word I can think for it. And then, so I kind of just kicked around the world for a bit. I went to Japan for 6 months. I traveled back overland on the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was great.
Really?
Yeah, it was amazing. I worked in Paris for a bit. I went to New York for a year and worked in New York for a year.
So what year would this be about?
This must have been all between the years of 92 and 95 or 96. Because I finished my architecture degree in 92 and I found woodworking by, I can't remember if it was 95 or 96.
And how did that happen?
Well, actually, so then I went back to Ireland and was working as a graphic designer briefly. It was just as computers were coming in big time. Anyway, I worked as a graphic designer and I was taking a few days off and was cycling through the west of Ireland on a cycling trip. And I got to this little village and it literally was a crossroads, like just a crossroads. And obviously there were 4 corners and it had a pub, and then this huge Victorian, and I'm not joking, a huge Victorian building that I didn't have a sign on it or anything. So I went down to the big building to see what was in it. And it was one of those reformatories, those boys' reformatories that run by the Christian Brothers, like one of these really awful, tragic places. But it had been decommissioned as that in sort of maybe like 15 years prior and had been taken over by a kind of local group and turned into a woodworking school. And I looked at, it was a summer break, and I looked at their show of work, and I was really impressed. But I just kind of didn't do anything. It just kind of like happened, and then I cycled on. And then I went to New York for a year, and then I had a phone call with my mother, and she said, I just met so-and-so's mother, somebody else's mother, in the post office, and she was sending in her son's application to that school, that woodworking school. And I was like, I want to send in an application. And I quickly, in New York, like over the course of 24 hours, scrambled together an application. And I remember going to the FedEx office in the rain, in the dark, and get my application over, because nothing was by email in those days. And so anyway, I got a place, and there I was a few months later in the west of Ireland. Had this school, which was, because no one locally kind of had the experience, or the kind of wherewithal to run the course, they actually got in an awful lot of all their teaching staff came over on kind of 2 and 4 week stints from England, and they were almost all John Makepeace graduates.
Huh.
So they kind of stumbled into the highest edge. This little school in the west of Ireland somehow had this kind of like connection to these incredibly high-end makers in England who loved coming over to Ireland to teach for these short breaks, because it was like a holiday for them as well. So they would come over and do a little, project, whatever. And I remember, I was probably there about 4 hours on the first day, and the first thing we had to do was flatten the soles of our planes, our metal planes, by grinding them with carborundum powder. And I was like, I love this. I love this. And when I look back, I'm like, how crazy could I have been to have loved flat? But I had this feeling that they were teaching us really well. I think that's what I love. I was like,
It does sound foundational, doesn't it?
Yeah, like to go back to this large number 6 plane and flatten the sole of it. But there was something about it that I loved.
What's the name of the school?
It's kind of lengthy. GMIT, which stands for Galway Mayo Institute of Technology, at Letterfrack, which is the name of the village, known as the Furniture College. So Letterfrack is the way it's just referred to. Everyone just calls it meaning the college.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. And how big a school was it? How many students?
Well, back then I think there were like 21 or 22 of us in each year, and there was 2 years. So it's like just, 40 odd students. And it's changed hugely over the years. It now has several hundred, still all based on furniture, but it's changed from a kind of craft orientation to a much more industry focused.
Oh.
So they do a whole lot more. There's like a whole bunch of CNC machines, and just a whole, much more industry focused. So very different. They changed because, understandably, there isn't much of a career path. It's certainly not a clear career path for somebody coming out with a kind of craft focus. Some of the people who were some of the kind of really high-flying students would go off and work in England at some of the high-end workshops in England. But it's not a lucrative career.
Yeah. So
it being a government-funded college kind of had an obligation to kind of make people into channel them towards a career that might actually work.
And so where did you get channeled into? Did you channel yourself into afterward?
I channeled myself into thinking that I was a furniture maker.
Right.
After my 2 years, I remember coming out and being like, okay, now I set up a workshop. And so I did at the back of my parents' little kind of farm. They had some empty old buildings that I set up into a little workshop. And I actually remember spending an awful lot of time studying fine woodworking quite carefully, because I realized how much I hadn't learned. Even with 2 years at college, there was just so much stuff I didn't know how to do. Like I hadn't a clue how to do. So I was really gleaning everything from magazines like it was Fine Woodworking and Furniture and Cabinet Making, the English magazine, reading them absolutely kind of like dedicatedly to try and learn. And I taught part-time at the architecture school like 2 mornings a week or something, because by that time they had opened up a workshop, and so they wanted somebody with a few practical skills. Yeah.
And so was it a while after that? Was that the soon after that you found Krenov's books?
So I must have finished the school in Ireland, the Letterfrack, in 1998 or thereabouts, and then somewhere between 1998 and 2001, I came across Krenov's books and was, like I say, so taken by them, and read the back cover of one of them, and it said James Krenov lives and works and teaches in Fort Bragg, California, and I used Google, which was like brand new at that point, and Googled Krenov, Fort Bragg, California. David Welter had luckily set up a website for the school. He, a really HTML, really basic website, but it was, so I this must be one of the earliest uses of Google, I'm thinking, back in about 2000s. And I fixed it up to come over here and to be in Fort Bragg for I actually thought, I thought to myself, if it doesn't work out, I'll just leave. I can leave by Christmas if it's no good. And then, of course, here I am 20 years later.
And so did you apply, you enrolled without going to see it? It was
I did. I was like, I can't afford to make 2 trips, so I'll just try it out. And I remember getting the bus up so being a European, of course, I assumed that there was like public transport to Fort Bragg.
Of course.
But there's 1 bus a day. And I actually thought the bus had hijacked me and has kind of kidnapped me, because I was like, there cannot be a town at the end of this road. This is just is way too weird. Because, you go through the redwoods on this road that is just getting so curvy, and then it gets curvier and curvier. And I was like, this is just insane. But anyway, they dropped me off in Fort Bragg, and I went to the school. But again, similarly, like a few days in, I was like, this is great. This is really good. I got so my little furniture making stint at the back of my parents' farm was great, and I learned a lot, but I didn't make much money. But my grandmother died in the spring of 2001, and she left me, a few thousand, which was able to get me over here.
Oh, that's wonderful. And what was the experience of arriving in Fort Bragg, going to the school, meeting the people there? And did I read that Krenov was still teaching when you arrived? And so
he was there for a year. He was there that year. That was his last year of teaching. Krenov was extremely cranky by that time. Pretty much unpleasant, actually. With glimpses of his charming self, but he was angry. I think he felt like he was being driven out of the place. He argued with the other teachers a lot. He wasn't particularly interested in the students. Just in many ways, just not at all the person that I had learned about through the books. So I just hung on to that person and didn't take much notice of the reality in front of me, to be honest. And I found the whole setup so lovely, like the support of the other the teachers and David and the other students and the place, and just everything was just so great that I stayed for another year.
So you're there 2 years.
I was there 2 years.
And I guess I was wondering how that experience, maybe you could talk a little about what that gave you, what the training there gave you, and what impact it had on the work that you did going forward.
Well, I remember prior to that, I would make, when I was making something, I would usually make a 1:5 scale model, and then I would make the real thing 5 times bigger. And it was almost like there was no difference other than the size between the little scale model and the large object. I kind of knew that I lacked subtlety, and that the details were not, if something looks the same as at 1:1 as it does at 1:5, there's something kind of missing. There's like a reality missing, that it should increase in complexity, really, or kind of interest at a larger scale. And it just, I feel like that wasn't happening. I feel like I didn't really know enough about wood. So really, the focus on starting with the material and kind of working your way out was different for me and new. And Krenov's focus on detail and kind of the interaction of the person with the piece, like the edges and small setback, little, shadow lines and things like that, were all what I think, and just the high level of craftsmanship. It was very different than, there had been a focus on craftsmanship in the school in Ireland. So, but this other one was more, well, I mean, in some ways it was kind of like hippie American, it was more about yourself, and how, so you really pouring yourself into it rather than seeing it as this kind of external object that was going to make you some money and, make you some whatever. Not that people didn't take pride in their work and invest themselves in it, but it was a different kind than this full on kind of pouring yourself into your work.
And so do you feel like that had a lasting impact on the way you work, that particular strand of it?
Yes, I think so. I think just the kind of focus on craftsmanship. I mean, I've long thought or wondered about what the craftsmanship offers to the object. Like, to what extent can the object exist with different levels of craftsmanship? To what extent is its meaning dependent on how it's made and how well it's made? And I think, well, some pieces only kind of gain their full meaning through how they're made, and other pieces not. But I think in my work, like, it wouldn't be the same if it wasn't kind of like well made, that if it was kind of, crappily made, it just wouldn't be the same thing. So it's therefore the craftsmanship is intrinsic to it. Yeah.
Right. And so after your second year, did you return to Ireland?
I did. And again, tried to have a little workshop, and actually failed more the second time, because by this time I was so much slower, actually, having come from the Krenov School.
They slowed you down at Krenov School.
Slowed me down, yeah. So it actually, yes, failed more epically that time. So I got it was like, so I went back with my partner who I'd met at the Krenov School. Together we were kind of like one day going like, what are we going to do? Like, how are we going to buy food? Like, it was like that. And I kind of like, I got a phone call like that day, or just within a few days, from the school in the college in Ireland where I had been, saying, do you want to...
At Letterfrack
at Letterfrack, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Saying, do you want a part-time gig? Or do you want a little kind of... they wanted me to curate a show for them. That's what it was. It was like some kind of anniversary, maybe the 20th anniversary or something of the school, and curate a show that June, I guess. And then by August, I was part-time. I signed up to part-time teach for them. And a year after that, I was full-time teaching for them. So basically, I became a teacher. Yeah.
But you maintained a shop through those years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what sorts of stuff were you making?
Mostly commissioned at that point, I think. Trying to remember. Yeah. I mean, and some... Well, the Crafts Council in Ireland, it's now called the Design and Crafts Council, I think, but at that time it was the Crafts Council. It was very active, very supportive, very interesting, organized quite a lot of exhibitions. And I kind of, they had a thing called Portfolio, which was kind of like a selection of makers around the country. Maybe there were like 5 woodworkers, 5, textile people. They were supposed to be, anyway, I was in quite a lot of shows with them, and that was really, so there was a mix of commissioned and kind of work for shows that would sometimes sell and sometimes wouldn't. But already I was then not dependent on selling woodworking for my kind of vast majority of my income.
There were some chairs that you made, and I think that one of them, or of that variety, is behind you in the on the screen.
Oh, that one, yeah.
Yeah, and I wondered if you could talk about that. I think you call them wingback, like a wingback type. I don't know if there's another descriptor for it, but anyway, if you could just talk about those. You've made quite a few of them, it seems.
Yeah. Well, so my continuing addiction to education carried on, and I decided to sign up for a master's program in Ireland, but I was going to continue my full-time teaching job as well. So I was like doing a distance master's program.
And where was that?
Well, they headquartered at the College of Art in Dublin, but I was 200 miles away in the west of Ireland. And supposed to be 2 years. I did it over the course of 3 years. But that was where I decided to use chairs as this kind of, I called them at that time vehicles for inquiry, really looking at craft, trying to examine, like I said a moment ago, like what craft kind of means. It's such a huge topic. I can't believe I was allowed to carry on with that title. But anyway, and using chairs to examine various aspects of craft. So it was basically in kind of two strands. One was looking at a traditional Irish vernacular chair called the Sligo chair and trying to do kind of riffs on it, basically. And then the other whole kind of strand came through this chair sold by IKEA, which is the Stefan Chair, which was its cheapest chair at that time. Probably, I think it's still in production, I'm not sure. And again, doing kind of versions of it. Like the first version was to remake the Stefan Chair, but in pear wood with, through Morse and tenon and kind of all the fancy stuff, all the crafty stuff. And to see what difference that made kind of to the object. Anyway, that got me on a kind of chair kick. And coming off that, I moved into that kind of wingback chair, which is kind of like, I think my initial impetus on that one was to try and make a chair that's a space, its own. And they were sometimes called porter's chairs because they were the porter at the door of, a castle or a big house would kind of sit in it and it wouldn't be so drafty for him, probably a him, to sit there and wait for someone to knock on the door. So it's about creating a space because, chairs are so often like an object in space, but instead to make a chair an object kind of that encloses space. That was like, I think, one of the initial impetuses for that chair.
So then after that, there's or maybe not after, maybe before and after, one of the things that you've made a lot of is boxes. And often in series, either kind of closely related or less so. And I wonder if you could talk about working in a series and what that does for you. And maybe we'll just stop there from that.
Sure. Yeah, I do think that chairs and boxes are the two main kind of strands of things that I make. Anyway, so boxes is our very first exercise in dovetailing at the school in Ireland was to make this little 100 millimeter cubed, 4-inch cubed box and then dovetailed and then plane into the dovetails to see how well you'd done, like to kind of check that you hadn't undercut too much and things like that. And I think that idea of putting a box together and then cutting away some stuff has been a kind of ongoing, just a kind of exploration. It's like, what would happen if you took that off? What would happen if you did that? And it's pretty much from that box that I did in like the second month of learning woodworking ever, has been, I didn't have to have another idea. All I had to do was just keep on going, just keep on trying out different versions of it. And so that makes them into different shapes, as you take parts of it away. And then sometimes now I like, well, what if you make the box into a different shape? The box itself, I happen to have right here, like this recent piece. I've turned off my camera. I don't know if you can see me.
No, can see it.
Okay, yeah. It's like very, very compound joints, if you know what I mean. Like nothing 90 around here.
Right.
Um, and so sometimes the box are made as 90-degree boxes and then shaped into, and sometimes made as like non-90 things to start with this. My patent is WTF dovetails.
That
because they're
is
so
because they're so what?
because they make your head hurt. You're going like, what the?
I was looking at that piece on your website and interested by the melding of the traditional and then this traditional joinery done in the WTF fashion, but then this piece of technology in it that, as you wrote, is going to be obsolete next week. So,
Yeah.
what about that interests you? That combination.
In a way, I mean, everything passes.
Because I should say it's a Bluetooth speaker, right? That's
right.
in
Yeah.
that box.
Everything passes. It's just a matter of when, really, isn't it? And it will presumably be obsolete far sooner than a chair will be, which is a fairly, culturally long-lived artifact. Although, actually, maybe on the way out, in some ways, chairs sitting being the new smoking and all that. But I mean, in a way, it's just throwaway, if you know. I mean, and in another way, it isn't at all. Made of like white oak. I don't know what I'll do with it when the people have asked me what I'll do with it when it gets obsolete. But actually, maybe what I'll do is I'll sew it around here.
Oh, it's
and make
a lid.
it a lid that lifts
How
up
about
to make
that?
it a lid. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. Good idea.
Another thing that really fascinated me about your work was the diverse sources of inspiration that you described some from architecture, from painting, from other crafts. There was a cabinet or two that had, I can't remember if you called it a quilt cabinet, but it was drawing on what's that? What kind of patchwork quilt design?
Mm-hmm.
And it was making me wonder what you would say about the process of design. Like, for instance, the patchwork quilt cabinet that I'm thinking of is fairly it's a rectangular wall cabinet with maybe 10 drawers and doors of all different sizes, and they're, I think, asymmetrically placed. So, what's your thought process as you launch into a project like that?
Well, I think that kind of series, of which I think there's only 3, maybe there'll be more in the future. That first one was my first project at College of the Redwoods.
Oh, really?
And yeah, I think really, I just wanted to get a lot of practice cutting dovetails in drawers and fitting drawers. It was almost as simple as that. And then I had to come up with an arrangement, and I had to have some wood for the drawer fronts. And I actually walked around the room and was like, "Do you have any scraps?" So I do somewhere have a list of, or a little drawer, kind of map of like which drawer, like where I got each piece of wood. So, the word inspiration is a little, the word inspiration implies that I at one moment had like a, light bulb go off above my head. And it really wasn't like that at all. It was just a kind of circumstantial. And some of it was the same impetus that people have when they're making quilts, which is to use some scraps, and I liked the flatness of it. And I think that has been an ongoing thing with some things, is like the flatness of that surface. It's like a painting, but then, it also has depth. Like there's, I don't think I've even mentioned it anywhere, but there's an Irish painter called Sean Scully, who does these kind of rectilinear arrangements. And, I like them a lot I like, the flatness of painting kind of mixed with the depth of drawers is another thing doors that you can actually kind of go into the object is another kind of interesting thing. In relation to that, I do sometimes things come along afterwards that are like post inspiration. I don't know what you'd call that. It's more like, so I think I saw the G's Bend quilt exhibition, for example.
Yep.
I think that was in about 2006. So it's like several years after I'd made it, but it felt like inspiration that happened afterwards. Yeah.
No, that's so interesting. Well, and that's what I was wondering about is it something where, I mean, you also mentioned an artist, didn't know how to pronounce her name, Natalie Depasquier or something like that.
Yeah.
And you mentioned her a couple times as someone whose work you really liked, and there was some relationship to things you had made, and I wondered if it was something where maybe which way around is it? Is it kind of like this post-inspiration, or is it you see that, you really love it, and you're thinking, well, maybe there's a way to adapt or just draw from that? And I should say that some of the pieces that you made that you referred to her work in relation to they have this mixture of that, like I was talking about early on, a traditional form, but then they also this infusion of kind of artistic abstraction and distortion. Nothing's quite square or quite flat, and her paintings are bit like that maybe, but anyway, if you could talk about her work and what the connection might be.
Oh, that was totally post-inspiration as well. I think I'd made one or maybe two of those kind of little distorted cabinets by then, and then found her work and was like, "Ooh, this is cool!" And it kind of was the same set of interests. I felt like we were both drawing off the same set of interests, even though her work is two-dimensional and these cabinets are three-dimensional. It's still kind of like to do with the convention of representation, like, axonometric and isometric drawing, and then kind of like playing with that convention. In my case, like back to 3 dimensions, and then in her case, kind of not doing that, but still like drawing things that couldn't quite exist, because it's like a little bit like Escher, but not quite as complicated, I guess, and not as, his are so kind of clever, but just a little bit of
it's a real Trump Lloyd thing, or something. Trump the brain.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was interesting to me too that she seemed to have started out as a furniture designer and was involved with Memphis, and so that was really fascinating. Then she completely seems to have left that behind and really pushed into painting and other fine
that
arts.
was an interesting kind of weird back connection that I came across her work, but her recent work, and had only through just looking at her website and realized that she'd been quite an important kind of especially kind of fabric and textile designer for Memphis in Milan in the kind of like late 70s, early 80s. So I don't quite know how it all kind of fits together, but there does seem, it is funny that she was involved with furniture way back then.
There was another piece you made, which you mentioned axonometric drawing, and maybe you can explain the difference in a minute, but I think it was a sliding lid box for an artist's pencils, and it had maybe 8 compartments inside that were all 4 and 4 symmetrically divided with thin dividers. And on the sliding lid, when the box was closed, you had done a parquetry representation of what's inside the box. And it was really wonderful. And the thing in photos, you don't know if it's open or closed, or you wonder. You're like, wait a minute, what am I looking at here? Then you see the one that's open, you can see, yeah, okay, I get it. But anyway, the axonometric drawing description there was pretty interesting.
Well, that was for her. That was for Natalie Depasquier. She's the artist that it was made for.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I wrote to her So I got like, minorly obsessed for a little bit and saw that her work was way too expensive for me to buy, and wrote to her. Like I'm the one and only time I've ever done anything like this. Wrote to her and was like, do you want to swap a piece of art for a piece of furniture? And she was like, no, I don't want a piece of furniture, but I do need a pencil box. So I was like, I'm going to make the best pencil box. And so, yeah, that was a kind of very direct response to her. She actually sent me a little sketch. I should have posted it somewhere. That is an axonometric of what she wanted the box to look like. And it had those, and I was like, well, I'll just make that the lid, So yeah, that's where it all came. That particular
That's
one. That's
really cool. Oh, one thing that struck me as someone who grew up about 10 miles from Morton Esherick's house and never left aesthetically, I saw that you were interested in him, and I wondered if you could talk about what his work means to you.
Oh yeah, I'm so interested in Morton Esherick. Well, in many ways. Well, he's the first, really. He's the first studio maker, so that makes him interesting. Like, he invented the field, pretty much, it seems like. So that is pretty impressive. And his whole kind of approach to life is so just, yeah, he was odd in a good way, in the best possible way. I mean, he was a proto-everything. He was a proto-hippie, kind of self-builder, studio maker, all kinds of things. And I also think it's interesting that we don't know that much about him as a person. I mean, I suppose we do a bit, but he doesn't seem to have been kind of like a fascinating person, if you know what I mean. In some ways, like Krenov had this like amazing life. Like, it's like a James Bond novel, like it's a film. It's like amazing, just globe spanning and everything. Morton Esherick was not that kind of interesting, but yet I think one gets such a sense of a person through the work, entirely outside of a biography or anything like that. Like, I don't really care very much about his biography, the specifics of his personality or anything like that, but I get a real sense of a person from the work. So I like that about it. I think that I like his kind of casualness almost. It's not Krenovian, and maybe I like it as a kind of counterpoint to some of the Krenovian stuff that I, deal with all the time. It's kind of casual, and like that hammer handle chair, it's so good. I mean, that's also kind of like an early kind of recycling, reuse, kind of stuff people do nowadays.
He used seatbelts and something else, and maybe it wasn't seatbelts, but something like that. I forget. A kind of plastic.
Yeah. He was just kind of like very open-minded, it seems like, and kind of casual about the craftsmanship. Not that it's bad in any way, but it's not fetishized in any way. I guess there's something a little. I would love to know more. Maybe I should just like read more or ask them about the guy he worked with, Jon Schmidt, was obviously a hugely important collaborator for him. And again, that's different as well. Like, we so much think of the kind of master, a solo run, and really it was a deep collaboration in terms of Jon Schmidt being able to actually make some of this stuff. Especially like that desk, that's all kind of trying.
The one with the aluminum top. It used to have an aluminum top, I guess, or does it now? I guess there's one that had a wood top, then someone really admired it and he sold it and then made another one.
Yes, I heard about that.
But that kind of triangular writing desk kind of thing. That one?
Yeah, I think that one is, that one actually is a kind of technical tour de force. So that must have been Jon Schmidt. Anyway, just on all these multiple levels, the fact that he's sometimes so kind of angular and faceted, and then sometimes so kind of curvy, like that music stand and the stairs and things like that, and sometimes kind of fusing those two things together. So the specifics of his kind of style I really like as well. And then the house being like this, gazumped work, as they call it, like it's a total environment. Even the light switches and everything are kind of like, a thing, and that he cared for so many things, without it being kind of like precious. It's not precious. It's all used and kind of functional. And it's one of my all-time favorite places, and I'm kind of ongoingly fascinated by him.
I wondered if the usefulness and functionality of everything was a connection for you, also with him. Just, it kind of feels like your work tends to be, although there's always ideas at play, it's also functional. And I don't know if that's always the case or always something you're aiming for or not.
It is kind of, and I have a lot of like feelings about the way people call themselves artists now. I totally, because I tend to think of art as being a different thing. It's not a thing that I'm doing. Therefore, I'm not an artist. But a lot of people who I have a lot of respect for call themselves artists. And I see the handiness of it, if nothing else, just because it's a word that has a kind of perhaps a fairly widely understood meaning, and it's a fairly broad term. But for myself, I tend to avoid it. And even if the function is pretty, vestigial at certain points, like those boxes are kind of small, you can't get a lot in there. I still, if they didn't open, I wouldn't make it, So the fact that it opens is enough for me. The fact that it has a lid, and so it always makes it a kind of another, like, I could make little cubic sculptures, but the fact that it has to open does add a whole layer of complexity and problem solving that I find necessary for myself. And yeah.
I was also wondering about, to go back to the kind of life story, how it felt to return to Fort Bragg. It was almost 10 years after you had left as a student, and be the lead teacher and director of the school that you'd gone through, and maybe you could say a little about what that felt like and feels like.
I think I was terrified for about 4 years, at least, maybe more like 8. It's really hard to be the co-teacher and the leader, the director of people who were your teachers, who are older than you, and who you have enormous respect for. It's hard. That's hard. And then to step into, the Krenov kind of legacy is huge, and how to kind of negotiate that. And there's a lot of very invested people around, and that's, great. Like that in the community, a lot of people who went through the school are still here one way or another and are very invested. And so trying to negotiate that, the desire for it to stay the same, the desire for it to change, the need for it to change, the ways in which it can stay the same, what's good about it, what should be not, what isn't so good, trying to just deal with all that is kind of big. And like I said, I think I was pretty shell-shocked for a bit, and just kind of realizing now that that's what was going on for a while.
But you've been able to, despite, that has to be a huge job, but you have continued to make things throughout. Mm-hmm. So you have a shop.
Yeah, I have at the moment I'm renting a little shop, and making things is one of the most, is really important to me. Probably, occasionally I call it, I think of it as my mental health salvation. If I wasn't doing that, I probably would be entirely, crazy in some way. It's hard because there's just like a bunch of things that you got to do in your life. And for me, one of them is woodworking, but I'm also like a parent and I have a full-time job, and, got these other aspects. So, but it's just one of the things, like those are in fact my 4 things: woodworking, teaching, being a parent. I think I've forgotten. Oh, maybe I only have 3 things in my life. Okay.
Being a person.
Yes, being a human being, yes. Woodworking, teaching, being a parent, yeah. Oh, staying fit.
Teaching, directing, staying fit, yeah. Another subject that we exchanged a little note about earlier was a project called Making a Seat at the Table. And I wondered if you could describe what that is and what it means to you.
So I think it was 2016. Student Deirdre Visser, who was and is the curator of the arts at CIIS, which stands for, I can never remember, something of integral studies. Anyway, it's a college down in San Francisco that has a gallery space, and she's the curator of it. And she was a student at the Krenov School. And one day she asked me, well, what's it like to be a woman woodworker? And I kind of just closed the conversation down pretty fast. I was like, hey, it's nothing, it's not important. I really did not want to be seen as a woman woodworker. It felt like being kind of ghettoized and, I guess that's it. Put into a smaller field, as it were. But for some reason, the conversation kind of continued, and she had been to a all women's college and taught at an all women's college at Mills College down in Berkeley, and coming from a completely opposite kind of point of view of it's not about ghettoizing, it's about having space of your own and things like that. So the conversation continued, and that June we organized a little kind of series of talks. We had the show down at the gallery in CIIS in San Francisco, the end of year show of the Krenov School students' work, and then we had a few kind of like talks every evening for a week, and kind of felt like we worked well together as a team to kind of bring together to talk about issues, things, topics around woodworking. And so we thought we'd go on working together and work on a project about women in woodworking, which was something that we just kept kind of circling around and talking about. Basically, it was almost like she was educating me in terms of, I think my attitude is fairly typical of my age and upwards, or that attitude of like, don't put me in a box. And it was like she was teaching me how to not think that. And anyway, we decided that we would work on a book. We worked with Phoebe Kuo, who's another student. She'd been the year before, whose like professional job prior to being a woodworker was working as an ethnographer, a kind of commercial ethnographer, which is basically like research for companies. It's somewhat like a kind of cultural anthropologist uncovering how you use things in your house and stuff like that. Anyway, very skilled interviewer. So we started by interviewing a number of women around the country, women woodworkers. And the idea was that we would pull this book together that would be a combination of these interviews and a kind of like a issue-related chapter of topics that sort of interspersed with these interviews. We met such amazing women all over the place. It was like, I was like, wow, does woodworking attract, like, it's like these women could have gone and been like, lawyers or surgeons or just kind of any really high flying thing, but they've chosen to pour themselves into woodworking. Very smart people like Nancy Hiller and Yuri Kobayashi and a ton of the Christine Lee. Actually, I have a list on my wall there. I could read you all out, but just some great conversations with women and how they had kind of, found themselves in woodworking. Some of them older, and therefore there were even fewer women around them at the time. We thought we would do a show of women woodworkers as well, and that actually happened way faster than the book. So we had met Jennifer Nava-Milliken, who's had just actually like 2 weeks before we met her, she had just been appointed as the director at the Center for Art and Wood in Philadelphia. And she was like, yeah, let's do a show. And so we were like, yes, let's do a show. So we did. And that went really well. And that was opened in November 2019. There were 44 women makers, or women identified makers in that show. And we really tried to focus on kind of like somewhat the edges of the terrain, like people who are crossing over into design somewhat. Someone like Yvonne Mouser is like sometimes doing batch production. People who are kind of closer to art. people who are running there, Nancy Hiller doing kind of, cabinet making, kitchen, that type of cabinet making. So all these different kind of edges of it, as well as like people like Christina Madsen, who's just, like off the charts craftsmanship is just mind boggling. I hadn't seen any of her work prior to that. I actually, the first time I ever saw it in person was at the show, like when the piece was delivered. And, I had to just stand there for like 10 minutes just kind of looking at it because it was just amazing. Her work.
What was the piece that she had?
It was a kind of jewelry cabinet, probably about nearly 5 feet tall, with kind of a light colored wood that had been, the way she does, chip carved into this kind of almost like a flowing, like a field of grass in the wind. And you realize, as you looked at it, especially as a woodworker, I'm like, wow, if any of those lines were wrong, she would have messed up the entire, the entire panel would be every line. But it was just not, it was not perfect like a CNC would make it. It was perfect like a human makes this, just ever so slight variations. And it really made me see again that sort of the hand matters. It's her hands and her eyes that make those what they are. They really, there's no, I have no bad feelings towards CNCs or anything like that, towards any tools. But in her case, it's just amazing. And one does feel that connection with a person, same as like, I guess with Wharton Escher, I feel this connection. You can feel Christina Madsen's concentration and attention going into that. Really just amazing. Anyway, there were lots of amazing pieces in that show, and it was very well received, and that was all great. And then we moved forward into the book, and much more difficult, I have to say. Writing a book is hard. And then the pandemic hit, and then it kind of fell apart as a collaboration. It was just the fact that we couldn't meet in person anymore. My parenting had to step up a notch, what with the Zoom schooling and all that stuff, all the anxiety over the pandemic. We did continue with teaching in person at the Krenov School. So we stopped for when it hit in March, we stopped till the end of that semester, but then started again that August with fewer. So I was teaching in person again, wearing a mask, which was just like, I was so happy to be able to teach in person, but wearing a mask while teaching is just, horrible. Anyway, it was just too much. Couldn't do it. So Deirdre has continued with the book, and it literally is going to the publisher any week now, and has been for quite a few weeks. But it literally is going to go any week now.
Wonderful.
To Rutledge, which is the publisher. And meanwhile, I guess, as it seemed like women in woodworking was actually a fairly low-hanging fruit. That there's a lot of people who aren't welcome in the woodshop or aren't made to feel welcome in the woodshop. There's a kind of a standard woodworker, and it's like a white male. And it's once one steps away from that, how people feel they're not, that isn't their place, has become much more of a kind of, what with last summer's racial reckoning and just everything, I think, is just making us look to see who should be there and how can one make them more welcome, and is it better for the field? Well, clearly it's better for woodworking in general to have a greater diversity of people in it. Plus it's just an equity issue. You should have, if I think it's a valuable thing, it should be available to everybody. So it actually made me question what I value in woodworking. And made me see that also there's a kind of class element to it, that it's because it's not lucrative, that there's it's kind of self-enhancement or self-enrichment, I think the word. That makes it seem like it's only available to the middle classes because they're the people who can afford to have their lives enriched, but really everybody's life is worthy of being enriched, and if this is a way that I think is possible for that to happen, that again should be available to everybody. Just because it's not going to make you a ton of money doesn't mean it shouldn't be available to you. You should be able to make that choice for yourself, so generally just trying to make the workshop a more open space. having said that, I personally never felt any ill will or unwelcome towards me, but there are two reasons that might be. It might be that I'm very blind to it, just like ignored it, whatever, my personality. And I think that does happen. And the other is that I was lucky, because I know that a lot of people have not had that. It hasn't been the same for them. I had male teachers throughout my woodworking. I've always never had a female woodworking teacher, and they have been nothing but incredibly supportive and incredibly, kind and great. So, it's not, this doesn't come from personal experience, but it does come from hearing a lot about how other people are made to feel in the wood shop.
Yeah. So how's that inclusivity at the school? It seemed to me that there were, I don't know numbers, but I always noted there were women in the school from way back, and far fewer than 50%. But the field has been so male centric for so long that as I kind of go around and meet people, it's typically been just almost all men. And so it was always like, oh, interesting. So, and I wonder how that's gone now at the Krenov School, where things are.
Well, they fluctuate. It's like the graph goes like this. 1 year, 2 years ago, everything's got so confused by the pandemic now. It's hard to remember whether to include it. Anyway, whatever. I think it was 2 years ago. We had 11 women out of the 23. And that was the first time we'd broken double digits. And I was like, yes, we've done it. But of course, the next year went down to like 6 or something. And, it depends who applies. It depends who applies. But on the other hand, who applies is a factor of where we're reaching out to. So, it doesn't let us off the hook. It fluctuates. Even more than a lack of women coming through is a lack of people of color coming through.
Same thing I've experienced totally.
Yeah, it's like how to tell people. I mean, so much of the Krenov School is the people who show up, who apply, it's very much a word of mouth network. And so that is by definition going to bring in people who are similar to each other. So it's how to break outside of that word of mouth network and find a kind of another network. We've been trying there's a separate nonprofit organization, the Krenov Foundation, which is very closely allied to the school, but it is separate, financially, and it gives scholarships to the school. And that has been a way to try and reach new people. A group of former students organized a raffle to raise money for BIPOC scholarships to the summer classes. The summer classes are kind of like an intro, so they're kind of easier. Rather than committing 9 months of your life, commit 3 weeks or 6 weeks. And they were they raised, I think they had an aim of 5,000 or 6,000, but they raised like 32,000 or something. Wow. And so we currently have those scholarship recipients at the school, and all we can really do is just keep trying, and just keep trying. Hopefully that might open up a little. That's another network that through those people, and the more we can do that. I mean, I do see that scholarships help enormously. They're not everything, but they are really good. And also big scholarships are good, scholarships that cover everything, because that's what can help somebody who wants to try it out, and doesn't necessarily have a set of tools and all that, doesn't. So that's one way we're trying to broaden things, is through scholarships.
Well, that is all we have time for on this episode of Shop Talk Live. We're planning on having Laura come back and answer questions. She has so much information to pass on to everyone. If you agree with her and her cause, and that of the Krenov Foundations, of finding ways of making woodworking more accessible to underrepresented communities, please head on over to theKrenovFoundation.org and donate. All right, that's all for this episode of Shop Talk Live. If you have any questions or comments on the show, please leave them on the show notes. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Thank you for listening.
If you love this podcast, you'll love Find Woodworking Unlimited. Access more than 40 years of articles, how-to videos, and project plans designed to take your craft to the next level. Check it out.